Hi, I'm Tony Jackson, and this is part 2. I cover more of the 12 pieces of the puzzle, which were absolutely essential, which guided me towards intermittent fasting, which then became the key to eliminating my type 2 diabetes in 2016 and 2017, and I lost 120 pounds while I was doing it. This is also the video I'm going to make the first real mention of the three game changers which finally pulled it all together for me, and one of those game changers is intermittent fasting. Now, in part 1, in my earlier video, I covered the first 9 puzzle pieces, and that was piece number 1 was saying what was not the problem despite the SSR beers, the smug self-righteous blamers. Piece number 2 was to say low fat, high carb is utterly discredited as a diet. Number 3, high fat protects health, doesn't hurt health. Number 4, calorie restriction diets, just not a sustainable solution. Number 5, you can get fatter and get diabetes while on an extreme blood sugar control diet, and I know because I did it, and this in fact is one of the things that says intermittent fasting is so uniquely powerful. Diabetes guidelines can place you in harm's way, was a shocker for some. Insulin being the key may not be too big a surprise for a lot of people. Insulin resistance and the body set weight strongly connected was an issue. And then piece of the puzzle number 9 was the sugar connection with fructose. Okay, now let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle, because this is a huge one when it comes down to the whole intermittent fasting topic. Piece number 10 was that my insulin resistance came from continuous exposure to insulin. Now, this one, it turned my world upside down. For the very first time, it didn't just give me a core problem to aim at. This piece of the puzzle gave me the direction for a solution, even though at that time I did not know it was called intermittent fasting. This piece of the puzzle explained how come I had continued getting fat and continued worsening my insulin resistance and continued my development of diabetes too, even while my diet was targeting low blood sugar to an extreme degree for nearly 25 years. And I explained in one of the previous pieces of the puzzle that I actually had eliminated added sugars, bread, rice, pasta and potatoes for most of 25 years because of efforts to try to control my insulin because I'd been obese for 30 years or more. You know, I'd even eliminated fruits and vegetables that were recorded as being high on the glycemic scale, and at the time it seemed to make sense. I'm not sure I'd do that again today. But at one time, for example, I took a lab test that showed my A1C was in good control. It's 5.8. While a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test showed that I had full-blown type 2 diabetes. My blood sugar was in good control. My type 2 diabetes was out of control. And again, this highlights some flaws in conventional diabetes treatment, but it also highlights the obvious question. How could I have developed worse insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes while my eating habits were so supportive of low blood sugar? I mean, outrageously so. Well, the answer is frightening because it highlights not just a huge flaw in our understanding of type 2 diabetes, but more importantly, it shows how many doctors and nutritionists are giving advice today that is almost certainly helping to kill people. Now, I'm not a doctor, as you know, so I'm going to explain this in my own terms. When you eat a typical meal, you put glucose into your system and your pancreas produces insulin to process that glucose. In a healthy body, the blood sugar level never gets too high, no matter how unhealthy the food is. And your blood sugar returns to normal within a couple of hours or so. That's just a healthy, normal insulin glucose response. But when someone with insulin resistance eats a meal, the pancreas produces the insulin, but now the cells of the body resist the insulin as it tries to do its job. The cells don't allow the insulin to put the glucose into the body's cells. They resist it. One outcome of the resistance is that the sugar spike can be very high enough to cause organ damage. A healthy system does not allow that to happen. A broken system does. But also, after 2 hours in a healthy system, the glucose has all been dealt with. When you have insulin resistance, that glucose is still in your system because the cells fought insulin when insulin tried to do its job. And therefore, there's still glucose in your system, and therefore there is still insulin in the system working its tail off to try to deal with that glucose. And in fact, that glucose might actually be in the body for several hours now. And that means the insulin is going to be flowing through your body for several hours. And in fact, it gets worse because the continued presence of glucose can mean the pancreas produces even more insulin to try to deal with it. And there's an analogy I'm adapting from Dr. Jason Fung, who by the way is brilliant. But it's like if you're trying to pack clothes into a bag that's already stuffed to overflowing and you simply throw more bodies at the task. Well, that's what's happening here. It's like the body throws more insulin at a problem, but that isn't the solution. So what you now have is even more insulin in your system. And it gets worse because that glucose isn't reaching your cells. So your brain is sending the message, hey, you're starving. Your cells need fuel. So what must you do? You've got to go out there and eat more. We call that message hunger. But when we obey the message and we eat some more food, we create more glucose that triggers more insulin release, and that cycle continues. So can you see how, if we have insulin resistance, as we do if we're type 2 diabetic, our bodies can have insulin floating around for hours and hours after a single meal, and not just a little, a lot of insulin. Well, then try this for size. What if we eat 3 meals a day? That's 3 separate occasions where we are pumping insulin into our system, insulin that's going to hang around for hours. But what if we also eat 2 or 3 snacks a day in between those meals? Each of those again triggers the glucose and triggers the insulin response. And when I say a snack, it doesn't have to be a formal snack. A latte, for example, is actually a lot of food intake, and it often has a serious carb component, and it can cause a serious spike in blood sugar. The ones we are aware of course, is a cookie or a candy bar. It's food, and food with carb and food with sugar. A granola bar, pot noodles, a bagel, a donut. In fact, even just milk in our coffee can cause an insulin response. They're all eating events. They all put glucose in our system. They all trigger insulin to be released. So can you see how it's easy for us to have insulin in our system close to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? In fact, we can be marinating our systems in insulin for the whole of the 24-hour day, 7 days a week. Especially if we have a snack before going to bed, and even more especially if we don't get too many hours of sleep. Why is this a big deal? In fact, it's a huge problem for us because the constant presence of insulin means we lose all sensitivity to it. When you're constantly exposed to something, think about the resistance to antibiotics that we develop because of overexposure to it. Think of how medical staff develop allergies to latex from constantly wearing latex gloves. When you're constantly exposed to something, it's common to develop resistance. So 24/7 exposure to high levels of insulin makes our insulin response worse and our insulin resistance worse, which then means sugar spikes are higher and they stay longer, which means more insulin for more time, and so on. It's not just a vicious circle here, it's a deadly cycle. Now, our culture then makes this even more likely because we tend to have breakfast soon after we wake up, and what we eat is often crap. I'm sorry, but things like cereals and sugary products. Apologies for the language, but you understand the passion, I hope. And then lunch a few hours later, and then dinner a few hours later, and of course, all the other eating events throughout the day, like I mentioned earlier, and the snack at bedtime. So our culture contributes in that way. It contributes in another way too, of course, which is that so much of what we eat and drink based upon what the authorities and the medical guys are telling us, is high carb. When we eat the way they tell us to eat, we cause glucose and we trigger insulin response. You know, even though the doctors are telling us to cut back on the sugar, they're still promoting basically low fat, high carb diets. Okay? And remember, just 7 days of overfeeding with fructose, which is in sugar, that was enough to develop insulin resistance, and 8 weeks of a fructose heavy diet was enough to develop insulin resistance. So what's really disturbing though is that the so-called experts, that the medical professions and the nutritionists contribute to the problem. Example, I know a guy with pre-diabetes, right on the verge of diabetes. His doctor has recommended absolutely that he cut back on his sugar, fair enough, but he's also recommended he eats 6 small meals a day. Even if they are small, combined with his proven insulin resistance, and remember he's pre-diabetic on the border of diabetes, 6 small meals a day pretty much guarantees he will be swimming in insulin 24/7. And if he eats low fat, high carb, which is the most common recommendation, this just makes a bad thing even worse. So my big realization was that for 25 years, while I'd been really good at eating foods that did not cause sugar spikes, in fact, while I'd eaten in a way that was aimed at creating a stable zone of insulin, just the fact I was eating 3 meals and 2 or 3 snacks a day and things like the latte, etc., etc. By doing that, I had guaranteed that my system was swimming in insulin 24/7, so, day after day, week after week, month after month. And that is how my insulin resistance got worse and my diabetes developed, even while I was eating in a way that was supposed to keep my blood sugar levels low, and I was doing it in a way that was, more conscientious than almost anybody else on the planet. That wake-up call, that realization was huge, because it shaped the solution that I had to look for. I had to look for something that wouldn't be putting insulin in my system all the time and keeping it there all the time. What could that be? You already know the direction I'm going in, but I'm going to let you see how I got there in the next video. In this video, I've only covered the 10th of the 12 pieces of the puzzle. And these were the key to me reversing type 2 diabetes and dropping 120 pounds. But I've spent a lot of time on just this one because 99% of people don't understand this, including the medical professionals and the nutrition specialists. And the impact of it can literally kill you. The impact of it gave me diabetes. It certainly sets the stage for worsening your blood sugar levels and your type 2 diabetes. Okay, but that does leave us with 2 more pieces of the puzzle, and they both relate directly to the same issue. The first piece of the puzzle is a breakthrough from a professor in the UK. It stood the world of diabetes on its head, but exciting as it was not workable for me, and it's not workable, in my opinion, for a lot of other people. It was not practical for me, and I needed something practical. So I had to look for a variation, and I did, and I found it. The second piece that's missing here is a mind shift. If I hadn't made that mental shift, I would never have looked for the solution in the one shape that mattered, which is intermittent fasting, and I would never have found it in the one place where it could be found, which you'll see in a moment. Out of those 2 pieces of the puzzle came what I call the 3 game changers that gave me the program I followed and that led me to reverse my diabetes. But we're already, 15, 20 minutes into this video. So I'll deal with those in a video part 3. But first, do me a favor, please. If you like this video, then subscribe to this channel right now. Just click on the bright red subscribe button underneath this video. I'm going to be publishing a lot of videos in the weeks to come, and you'll be notified first when I do by subscribing. Also, do be aware, I provide a lot of information on this particular page of a website that I share with my daughter. fuelupshapeup.com/intermittent INT Fast Diabetes, which of course stands for Intermittent Fasting Diabetes. So that's fuelupshapeup.com/INT Fast Diabetes. You don't have to remember that. It's in the description below this video. If you're serious about improving your diabetes, without meds or even just controlling your blood sugar levels or reversing pre-diabetes, by the way, visit the page on our website, take the time to read more about my story, and watch my video and see if you're interested in my case study. It's actually a combined guide and case study where I explain in detail exactly what I did, why I did it, to reverse my type 2 diabetes and drop 120 pounds on the journey. And as I said, there's also a link to the specific page that you should visit in the description below this video. Now I want to turn this over to you just for a moment. I'm curious, if you're perfectly honest with yourself, how many separate eating events do you have in a day? It can be a meal, a snack, a latte, donut, bagel, candy bar, granola bar. I'm curious, so please tell me your answer in a comment. I'd really like to hear your feedback on this. Thanks for your time.